Thank you for coming, especially second day, first talk in the morning, and the first talk is about rhetoric. Maybe it doesn't sound so exciting. So you all are brave souls. But my name is Lance Cummings, assistant professor of English at University of North Carolina in Wilmington, and I focus a lot on researching rhetoric and writing. And so this is my second time at SOAP, as Gosha mentioned, and you may be wondering, well, what am I doing here? Or what's rhetoric got to do with it? Well, let me explain. So first, let's get on the same page. Now, I don't know how it is in Poland or in other countries, but we do use the word rhetoric a lot, but it usually is restricted to the idea of empty political discourse without substance. And, that's just a bunch of rhetoric. Or that's just a bunch of bullshit. So this is what we call rhetoric as bullshit. Now, to be fair, we apply this to all politicians, not just whoever happens to be in the White House. But as you may or may not know, the idea of rhetoric actually goes back thousands of years to ancient Greece. And so what I want to do today is just share some of my thoughts about what rhetoric has to say about content as code. First of all, this is our usual way of thinking about content, code, communication. This is called the transactional model of communication. And this is the idea that we have content, we have an idea, for example, the idea of a tree, and we have to codify that in some way, either in language or picture or written text. And then we send it through this channel to the receiver, and then they decodify it. Now, there's a lot of things wrong, actually, with this model of communication. This is often how we think about writing, that we think about it as content and code. And what this does is separates content from code. But if we look at how content is developing today, it becomes obvious that it's harder to do that. This is just a simple example of HTML, but with hypertext, you have content in code. The content is not the same without the code, right? So it's difficult to separate the two. So one of the things that I'm going to use rhetoric for today is to talk about to argue that content should actually be a verb. We don't write content, we content. Now, that doesn't sound good in English, but I think you get the point. Content is constantly developing, it's moving, it's going through networks, and we don't just write it, we make sure that content gets to the right people at the right place to do the right things in the right situations. I'm also going to add an ethical component to this. And this is a term that we use called right use. And this is basically, you can think of this in terms of technology. We often argue whether a new technology is going to be good or bad. Oh, the cell phone is going to ruin young people, right? Because it's evil. But in rhetoric, we say, no, technology is not good or bad. It's how you use technology. So it's the right use of technology, the right use of language, the right use of rhetoric. We can use that in a lot of different situations. So just so we're on the same page, let me tell you a little bit about the history of rhetoric. So as I mentioned, rhetoric goes all the way back to Aristotle, and he originally defines this as the study of the available means of persuasion. And basically what he noticed was that certain politicians or speech makers were better at getting things done than others. They were better at giving speeches, at influencing their audiences, and making society change and do things. And his idea was, well, let's study those speeches that are working the best, figure out what elements make those the best, and maybe we can teach people to become better communicators, speakers, better influencers of society. As rhetoric develops in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, it develops into really 5 areas of study, not just putting words together or giving a speech. And these are called the canons of rhetoric. But basically, invention is how do you come up with ideas about what your speech is going to be about, or your argument. How are you going to arrange your argument in a way that makes the most sense or convinces your audience in the best way? Style, what kind of language are you going to use to make your ideas accessible and effective? Memory, how are you going to remember what you're going to say? And then delivery, often referred to nonverbal aspects, so how are you going to use your hands, your facial expressions, those kind of things. There we go. But it's important to realize that how we use rhetoric and how we think of rhetoric actually changes as technology changes. So the printing press comes around, and now we think of content not necessarily as speech within a forum or a political forum, but we're thinking now mostly content in the form of text, books, magazines, journals. And so now we think of, when we're thinking of arrangement, we're thinking of paragraphs, chapters, sections, those kind of things. And style becomes a lot about grammar and punctuation, and we still think about content a lot in these ways. But of course, there's another shift in technology that's happening today, and that's the digital world. And so again, we're thinking about rhetoric in different ways and applying those canons, using those canons of rhetoric in different ways. So basically, I could take all the talks, I think, that happen here at SOAP and put them into one of these categories. So invention, I'm thinking design thinking, coming up with ideas. Arrangement, structuring content easily goes into that area. Style, plain language. Memory, user design, how do you get users to remember a process. And delivery, how do you get the content, how are you going to deliver the content? Online help, PDF, podcast, video, all those kind of things. So technically, I could probably stop now. You know what rhetoric has to do with the SOAP conference. But I still got 10 minutes, and I'm a professor, and I like to complicate things. So here we go. So scholars today are actually redefining rhetoric as performative action. In other words, rhetoric has to be within a network of interaction to be effective. Any rhetorical act is both saying and doing. So for example, if I'm giving a speech, it's effective because I'm in the proper network and it's doing things with people and with society in order for it to be effective. And we can think of this as content as code. A rhetorical act is both content and code. But an important part of this is understanding that these networks have to be built and maintained in networks of goodwill. And a good example here is thinking about what we do as technical writers. So if the old way of thinking about technical writing is you get the content, you put it into a document, a PDF, and you just send it out to the user. Now, more and more technical writers are creating interactive spaces to allow users to interact with content in different ways. So it's not just about creating content, it's getting people to interact with content in the right way, to do the right things in the right places. In order to do that, you kind of have to have a little bit of goodwill towards your user, right? You want to help your user. If there's no goodwill to your user, then it's not as easy to build these networks. Now, another Greek word. Phatic is, this is called the phatic model of communication. This comes from linguistics, but it originates with the idea that sometimes communication is not communicating information or persuading, it's actually building and maintaining networks and connections. So sometimes you post on Facebook just to keep your connections alive. Sometimes you send out an email just to keep that connection alive. It doesn't give any information, doesn't persuade. But you can actually think of this conference from a phatic perspective. That it's not about getting information out. It's not about persuading people. It's about building and maintaining networks and of interaction. So knowledge and content can go all sorts of places. It's about establishing ongoing fruitful relationships or creating goodwill. So another way to look at this is we use the term invitational rhetoric. So instead of looking at a speech, like the talk that I'm doing right now, as me trying to persuade you or give you information, we can see it more as an invitation. So I'm not trying to give you information about rhetoric. I mean, that's nice. I'm not trying to persuade you of something, maybe just a little bit, but the main purpose of this talk is to open up connections between my conversations about rhetoric and the SOAP community. And so I'm inviting people into a dialogue, into a network, so that we can interact in new ways and develop new kinds of knowledge, which requires goodwill. And if that goodwill breaks down, then those networks don't work as well. So this actually goes back to another another rhetorician called Quintilian in the medieval times, and he redefined rhetoric, and this is kind of the ethical aspect that I want to talk about. He redefined rhetoric not as persuasion, but as a good man speaking. In other words, rhetoric doesn't work if you're not a good person, or if you don't have goodwill towards your audience. If you don't have goodwill towards your audience, then it all breaks down. So I want to say that content as code is a good person coding. That you need to have goodwill towards the users, towards stakeholders, in order to make these networks work. And I would say this is one reason why I think SOAP is such a great conference, right? So this room is full of good people, I think. Mostly good people, right? But, and also we have a lot of goodwill towards each other. So this establishes fruitful relationships. The content is shared, and we get different ways of seeing, and we're creating new types of interaction around content as code, for example. And I would imagine that you're good at your job because you have goodwill towards users or towards other people that are in your network. And that's what makes you so good at what you do. So the first thing I want to say about content as code, that it is about establishing and maintaining relationships where content can get to the right place, to the right people, to do the right things at the right time. But I want to add a second thing to this, that in order to build these networks, we actually require a particular kind of knowledge, a kind of knowledge that doesn't often get talked about or respected enough, I would say. And this is cunning. And this might seem odd because I just said it's about being ethical, right? And cunning, usually a cunning person is kind of not very nice, evil, taking power for themselves, causing mischief, and all those kind of things. But guess what? Aristotle is going to clarify this for us. So Aristotle had three types of knowledge. You have episteme, and we can think of this as kind of scientific knowledge, universal knowledge, rule-based knowledge. This is the kind of knowledge that your subject matter experts have. Subject matter expert. Then you have a techne, and this is kind of skill-based knowledge. So your ability to cook as a techne, or to do DITA, or write HTML, or use a radio. That's all user-based knowledge. And you can really see that we visited Motorola Solutions earlier this week, and I think you can see this organization in some companies, but we went to the offices where the subject matter experts were, and they're creating their knowledge, right? And then you go to the labs, where they are, the testing labs, where they're testing the techne part of that knowledge. Well, who connects those two areas? It's the tech writing department, right? And that's the third type of knowledge that Aristotle talks about. And he calls this metis, which is translated basically as cunning intelligence. So for example, if you're a politician, you may know everything about the government. You may know how to fill out all the paperwork. But if you don't have cunning, then you're probably not an effective politician. But of course, we often think of cunning as in a negative way. So this is Loki, the god of mischief and fire, and he's very cunning, right? But I actually want to flip this on its head, that there's actually a right use of cunning. So I debated on whether or not to include this, but because not everybody in this room is Game of Thrones fans, I'm assuming. So this is a little Easter egg for those of you that are into Game of Thrones. So this guy has cunning. He uses his cunning to manipulate systems, build networks, in order to give him power and to get him, well, maybe on the throne. This guy has cunning, but he uses his cunning to build systems and networks that gives power to other people, presumably for the good of the realm. This guy has no cunning whatsoever. But he does have a very strong sense of ethics, right? Now, spoiler alert, it doesn't really end well for any of these guys, but we could argue that one of them built a more effective, more productive, more sustainable network, but we'll argue about that over beer tonight, maybe. Here's a better example that probably all of you can relate to. So I was interviewing a technical writer not too long ago, and she was talking about the difficulty of getting information, getting knowledge from a subject matter expert. You guys don't experience that, right? But, and just couldn't get the information. So there's no goodwill, right, between the technical writer and the SME. And so the network is breaking down. So she finds out what his favorite cupcake is, and takes him the favorite cupcake, sits down while he eats the cupcake, and gets the information that way. And so now every time she needs something, she brings a cupcake. So she's just established a network, a connection there, using cunning, I would say, cunning intelligence in the right way. So really, content as code is about building and maintaining, using your cunning to build and maintain networks of knowledge to get content to the right place, to the right people, at the right time. And so manipulating a sentence to make it clear to audience, that requires a certain amount of cunning, right? Structuring your content in a way that makes it work or go to the right places, that requires a certain degree of cunning. And I would say this is perhaps the most important kind of knowledge that makes our networks work. So what am I saying basically? I'm saying you guys are the 21st century writers. You're not just writing content, you're not just writing code, you're actually using your cunning to build and maintain and establish fruitful relationships of goodwill. And I think this is the most important kind of knowledge, and really you should probably get paid more for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Guys, I told you, a university guy on the soap stage, right? Game of Thrones. Have you seen it all? I haven't. I'm super excited to finish. I was waiting till after soap. Questions? Do you have questions? Was there a hand out? Yeah, there's a hand right there.
I guess the soaps are still coming because I need another soap, I guess. So I'm going to use this opportunity because I have a professor and I on stage, and I was wanting to ask you. I know you're familiar with Schopenhauer's work, The Art of Winning an Argument, the book, famous heuristic tricks, 38 rhetoric tricks. How do you see that fit into the whole scheme of rhetoric and technical writing?
So, what was the first part again?
Well, are you familiar with the Schopenhauer's work? Yeah, the famous book.
Oh, Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, The Art of Winning. Yeah, The Art of Winning an Argument, and he actually described the gist of rhetoric, winning an argument, and he breaks it down into 38 tricks. And how do you are you fitting that into your research, or how do you make that maybe?
Well, I think maybe I need to now. That's awesome. I did not expect a question about Schopenhauer. Actually, one of my favorite philosophers, but from years back. But basically, so Schopenhauer actually does have, a lot of philosophers you'll find actually do write about rhetoric, but we kind of ignore those aspects oftentimes. And he's created a model, a kind of rules of argumentation on how to manipulate discourse and to trick people to agree with you, kind of way. And so the question would be, is what Schopenhauer, is his rules, is it the right use of rhetoric? And that's a really good question, and I'd have to go back and look at it again. But I would say probably if you can follow Schopenhauer's rules and not be a good person, then it's probably not the right use. But maybe you could use Schopenhauer's rules, the tricks, but in the right way, if you have goodwill toward your audience. Can you do that? I don't know. I have to look at some of those rules, but yeah.
One more question here.
So, if not Schopenhauer, can you recommend some reading? Machiavelli or Sun Tzu, The Art of War, or I don't know.
Yeah, so actually there are some rhetorical analysis of all those books. And actually, so we have a book called The Rhetorical Tradition in the US, and it actually has Machiavelli in it. I don't think it has the art of war, but we have some people who analyze that. Game of Thrones, maybe read those. Actually, the book that I was cited on the slides here, it's not. It doesn't sound like an exciting book, but it's actually a pretty accessible book, and I think useful for people in the profession to kind of think about what we do, how communication's changed, and what we do and how we think about it differently. And I think it could be a useful book for people to read too.
One more question.
Hi, you were speaking about goodwill towards other people. How do you define goodwill? It's you knowing what's better for them, or they knowing what's better for them. So you can easily go on a way to dictatorship, thinking that you are inherently a good person because you know better than them. That's my question.
Yeah, and I think though it maybe isn't thinking you know what's best, but having maybe good intentions. I mean, of course it breaks down. Like we don't. It's something we have to build and maintain. It's not something that we build it and it's just there and it stays that way. And so we may think our goodwill is going to do a particular thing, and then we realize it's not working, it's not building goodwill. And so we have to change how we do something. And that there's cunning again. I'm changing my approach because it's not working. So that would be, it's not a thing that we have that never changes. It's something that we're constantly adapting, building, and changing because things break down and things don't work.
Okay, I know that we had, one more question right there, and let's make it the last one.
Hi, good morning. You said that rhetoric is all about creating relationships, and that puts in the human factor. On one hand, there's a movement towards natural language. On the other hand, simplified technical English is also a big thing, especially in high-tech industries. So how do you code your goodwill into simplified technical English, which is really unpersonal?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think coding goodwill. Well, there's another aspect of this that I didn't get into, but understanding how networks influence our goodwill, influence how we do things. So actually, the coding itself is influencing how we build those networks and things. And so I think that it's not just the code by itself, but it's how it's interacting within the system that creates this, that maybe is a part of that goodwill. So you can't necessarily isolate one thing. There's system theories that say you can't isolate one thing and just understand that. You have to understand it and how it connects with everything else. And so coding is just, even if it is just code, it's not there by itself, but it's actually interacting with all these other things. Human language and human variables and those kind of things. I don't know if that answered the question, but.
Okay, you can continue after the talk and during the breaks. Thank you so much, Lance. It was an honor to have you. I'm so happy you're here.
It's an honor for me, so thank you.
Thank you.